Right now, while you're reading this, a decision is being made inside your body, not in your head. Lower, somewhere between your stomach and your intestines, roughly 500 million neurons are firing. They are processing information, sending signals, adjusting chemistry, making choices about what to absorb, what to reject, what to speed up, what to slow down. And your brain, the one you think of as you, is almost entirely out of the loop. It doesn't get consulted. It doesn't give instructions. It finds out about most of what happens down there the same way you find out your flight has been delayed. After the fact, if at all, you have a second brain. It lives in your gut. It has been running significant portions of your life since before you were born. And for most of human history, and for most of modern neuroscience, it was almost completely ignored. That is changing, rapidly. And what scientists are finding is strange enough to make you question something you probably take for granted every single day. The idea that you are run by the brain in your head. Let's start with the basics. Your gut contains what scientists call the enteric nervous system. The word enteric just means relating to the intestines. But that name dramatically undersells what it actually is. The enteric nervous system is a dense, interconnected web of neurons that lines your entire gastrointestinal tract, from your esophagus all the way down to your rectum. It runs along the walls of roughly 30 feet of digestive tubing, woven into two distinct layers of neural tissue, each one doing different jobs. The numbers are staggering. Your enteric nervous system contains somewhere between 200 and 600 million neurons. The most commonly cited figure is about 500 million. For comparison, your spinal cord contains roughly 100 million neurons. A rat's entire brain contains about 70 million. A cat's entire brain contains roughly 760 million. Your gut, in terms of raw neuron count, is in the same ballpark as a cat's brain. Not a region of a cat's brain. The entire thing. And unlike most peripheral nerves in your body, which are essentially wires, carrying signals to and from the central nervous system, the neurons in your gut form actual circuits. They synapse onto each other. They process information locally. They generate coordinated responses without waiting for instructions from above. This is what makes the enteric nervous system genuinely different from every other nerve network in your body outside the brain and spinal cord. It can think, on its own, without you. The man who first properly mapped and described this system was a British physiologist named John Newport Langley. In 1921, he was the first to formally identify the enteric nervous system as a distinct division of the autonomic nervous system, separate from the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems that most people learn about in school. But the person who turned it into a subject of serious modern fascination was Michael Gershon, a neuroscientist at Columbia University who spent decades studying the gut's neural architecture and eventually wrote a book about it in 1998 called The Second Brain. Gershon's central argument was radical at the time. The gut is not a passive recipient of instructions from the brain. It is an independent neural processor. A second brain, one that evolved long before the head brain, that operates according to its own logic, and that communicates with the head brain in ways that are far more bidirectional and far more weighted toward the gut than anyone had previously assumed. Here is the fact that stops people cold when they first hear it. 90% of the communication between your gut and your brain travels upward, not down from the brain to the gut, up from the gut to the brain. The vagus nerve, the main communication highway between the two systems, carries signals in both directions. But roughly 90% of the fibers in that nerve are afferent, meaning they carry information from the gut up to the brain. Only about 10% carry instructions from the brain down to the gut. Your gut is not listening to your brain. Your brain is listening to your gut. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal architecture of the nervous system. And it raises an uncomfortable question. If most of the communication is flowing upward, then how much of what you experience as thought, feeling, and intuition is actually originating in the gut and being interpreted by the head brain after the fact? More than anyone is comfortable admitting. Let's talk about serotonin. You probably know serotonin as a brain chemical, the mood molecule, the thing that antidepressants work on, the neurotransmitter associated with feelings of well-being, happiness, and calm. Here is what most people don't know. Approximately 95% of the body's serotonin is produced and stored in the gut, not the brain. The gut, The gut produces serotonin primarily through specialized cells in the intestinal lining called enterochromaffin cells. These cells detect what's happening inside the gut, the chemical composition of food, the presence of pathogens, the stretch of the intestinal walls, and release serotonin in response. That serotonin then acts locally, helping to coordinate gut movements, regulate secretion, and modulate the activity of the enteric nervous system itself. It also enters the bloodstream and communicates with the brain through multiple pathways. Your emotional state is not generated by the brain and then felt in the body. It is, to a significant degree, generated in the body and then interpreted by the brain. When you feel a pit in your stomach before a big presentation, that is not your brain sending anxiety signals downward into your gut. That is your gut detecting a threat state in the body and communicating it upward. The feeling you experience as anxiety in your chest and stomach is largely originating there. Your brain is the interpreter, not the author. The expressions we use, gut feeling, gut instinct, butterflies in the stomach, trust your gut, are not metaphors. They are imprecise descriptions of a real biological phenomenon that existed in human experience long before we had the neuroscience to explain it. Now let's talk about the part that will genuinely unsettle you. Trauma. It has been known for decades that people who experience significant psychological trauma show abnormal gut function. Irritable bowel syndrome is dramatically overrepresented in populations with PTSD. Survivors of childhood abuse have higher rates of functional gastrointestinal disorders. Stress and emotional disturbance reliably produce gut symptoms. The conventional explanation was top-down. The brain, under psychological stress, sends dysregulatory signals to the gut. The gut reacts. But the emerging picture is considerably more complex and considerably stranger. The gut doesn't just react to trauma. It may store it. In 2020, research published in the Journal of Neurogastroenterology and Motility found evidence that the enteric nervous system undergoes structural changes in response to traumatic stress. The neural circuitry of the gut actually rewires itself. The connections between enteric neurons change. The sensitivity of gut sensory neurons increases. The gut remembers, not in the way the hippocampus stores episodic memories, not as a narrative, not as images or words, but as a physical state, a heightened readiness, a set of neural connections shaped by past experience that influences present perception and behavior. This is why trauma survivors often describe physical sensations, constriction, nausea, a sense of dread that seems to rise from the body rather than the mind, that can be triggered by stimuli that the conscious brain doesn't even register as threatening. The gut registered it. The gut remembered. And the gut responded before the brain had time to form a thought. The somatic therapists and body workers have been saying this for decades. The neuroscience is only now catching up. But here's where the second brain story gets even stranger. Because the enteric nervous system doesn't just respond to what your brain is doing. It has its own agenda, its own priorities, and it communicates with the brain in ways that actively shape your perception, your mood, and your decisions in real time. The gut microbiome, the roughly 100 trillion bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms living in your intestines, is now understood to be a major player in this communication. These microorganisms produce neurotransmitters. They release compounds that cross the gut lining and enter the bloodstream. They communicate directly with enteric neurons, and those signals make their way up the vagus nerve to the brain. Your gut bacteria are, in a very real sense, talking to your brain. And your brain, in a very real sense, is listening. Studies in germ-free mice raised without any gut microbiome, show dramatic alterations in behavior, stress response, and anxiety compared to mice with normal gut flora. When these germ-free mice are given gut bacteria from anxious mouse strains, they begin exhibiting anxiety-like behaviors. When they are given bacteria from calm strains, they become calmer. The personality of the donor is being transferred through the gut bacteria. This has been replicated across multiple species and multiple research groups. The gut microbiome influences behavior, not just digestion, not just immune function, behavior. In 2019, a landmark study of over 1,000 people published in Nature Microbiology found that specific gut bacteria species, particularly Coprococcus and Dialister, were consistently depleted in people with depression, even after controlling for antidepressant use. The correlation held across independent cohorts in multiple countries. People with less of these bacteria were more likely to be depressed. People with more were less likely to be. The researchers were careful to note that correlation is not causation. But the signal was strong enough that several major pharmaceutical companies are now developing what they call psychobiotics, probiotic strains specifically engineered to produce neuroactive compounds and target mental health conditions via the gut-brain axis. We may be approaching an era where depression is treated not only with drugs that target the brain, but with bacteria that target the gut. And this brings us back to the question that the entire field of gut-brain research is circling. Where does the gut end and the self begin? If your mood is partly a product of your microbiome, if your anxiety is partly generated in your enteric nervous system, if your intuitions are partly gut signals being interpreted by the brain as thoughts, then the thing you call your mind is not localized in your skull. It is distributed, spread across the 30 feet of your digestive tract, encoded in the 500 million neurons of your second brain, shaped by the trillion microorganisms living in your intestines who have been influencing your behavior and your emotions and your decisions for your entire life without you having the faintest awareness that they exist. The philosopher Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He placed the self in the mind in the brain in the head. But the neuroscience of the enteric nervous system suggests something considerably more unsettling. You think everywhere. The thinking is distributed. The self is not a single location. It is a network. And a significant portion of that network, possibly the oldest, most fundamental portion, is not in your head at all. It is in your gut. It has been there since before you were born. It processed its first signals while you were still a fetus, before the brain in your head was even fully assembled. It has been running you, influencing you, shaping you every moment of every day of your entire life. And until about 30 years ago, science barely knew it existed. You have a second brain. It doesn't think in words. It doesn't think in images. It thinks in hunger and nausea and dread and the wordless bodily certainty that something is wrong before you can explain why. And right now, while you're sitting here reading this, it is thinking, whether you know it or not.